It was an ordinary day at a high-end charity event, the kind where the who's who of the corporate world gather to mingle, make deals, and perhaps feel a little better about their fortunes. The air buzzed with laughter and polished small talk, the clinking of champagne glasses, and the low hum of well-dressed guests discussing the latest trends. The lighting was perfect, the food was extravagant, and everything was just how it was supposed to be. But there, in the midst of this luxury and success, something unexpected happened. A moment that would leave the entire room stunned. A little boy, barely more than 5 or 6, with a face that still carried the innocence of childhood, walked up to the billionaire CEO, who stood at the center of the crowd. His small feet patted softly on the marble floor as he approached the towering figure, his eyes full of curiosity and perhaps a little fear, locked onto the man who had been the subject of countless headlines and boardroom meetings. But what the boy said next, what came out of his innocent lips, was anything but ordinary. "Hey, sir," the boy's voice rang out, cutting through the noise of the event. "My mom told me you abandoned us." The words were simple, yet they hit like a thunderclap, shaking the air around them. For a moment, everything froze. The chatter in the room dulled, as if the universe itself held its breath. The billionaire CEO, a man known for his sharp mind, countless business moves, and the wealth that placed him at the top of the world, was taken aback. His gaze softened, perhaps with the shock of the truth, piercing through the carefully curated image he had spent years building. But there, in that fleeting moment, the contrast couldn't have been more striking. The little boy, innocent and unguarded, stood before this titan of industry, who, in his years of power, had never expected such a raw, unfiltered encounter. The tension was palpable. Around them, people tried to shift uncomfortably, unsure of what to make of the interaction. It was a moment of truth, a quiet, unsettling moment that challenged everything the billionaire had constructed. As the boy stood there, his words lingering in the air, it wasn't just a confrontation. It was a reminder of a past that the CEO may have tried to bury, a past that the boy's mother had not forgotten. Who was this child? And why did his mother feel compelled to say such a thing to him? Was it a random encounter, or did it carry a deeper weight, a story that had yet to be told? The questions hung in the air as the CEO slowly bent down, his expression unreadable. The room held its collective breath. Was the billionaire about to answer? Was he going to deny the accusation, brush it off, or perhaps face the music in a way no one ever expected? It was a moment of reckoning, not just for the man, but for everyone who witnessed it. For those who had admired his wealth and success, it was a shocking glimpse behind the curtain. And for the little boy, it was a question that had likely haunted his family for years. A question that had finally found its way to the person who might be able to answer it. As the CEO stood there, caught between the past and present, what would he say? What would his next move be? The world awaited an answer, but as the scene unfolded, one thing was clear. Nothing was going to be the same after this moment. The tension was too thick, and the story too powerful, to simply fade away. In the next part of this story, we'll dive deeper into the history that led to this unexpected confrontation, the secrets that were buried, the lives affected, and the question that lingered in the air. Could this encounter change everything? Or was it just another fleeting moment in the tangled web of life? Stick with us to find out what happens next. As the billionaire CEO stood frozen, still kneeling before the boy, the room seemed to close in on him. The words, simple but loaded, echoed in his mind, their weight heavier than any boardroom meeting or financial forecast. He had built an empire, crafted a legacy, But now, in the presence of this small child, it all felt hollow. Who was he now? The businessman who could buy anything? Or a man haunted by a past he thought he had outrun? The little boy's name was Max, and his mother, Sarah, had once been a part of the billionaire's life. A long time ago, before the polished suits, the corporate dinners, and the world of high-rise buildings, there had been a time when the CEO was just a man, flawed, uncertain, and very much in love. Sarah had been the bright, ambitious woman by his side, the woman who had believed in him even when he had nothing. They were a team. At least, that's what Sarah had thought. But then, somewhere along the way, things had shifted. He had become consumed by his ambitions, more focused on wealth and power than the woman who had supported him from the beginning. The late nights in the office turned into weeks spent apart. The phone calls grew fewer, the conversations more strained. Sarah had tried to hold on to the love they once shared. But in the end, the man she had known was no longer the man standing in front of her. She had given him everything, her heart, her trust, and ultimately, her dreams. And in return, he had walked away. But the story didn't end there. Max had been born in the midst of their fading relationship, a child who had grown up hearing nothing but whispers of the father who had abandoned them. Sarah, though strong and independent, never had the answers Max needed. All she could do was tell him stories of a man who once loved her, but had chosen another life, a life that didn't include them. She raised Max on her own, never asking for help, never looking back. But the anger, the hurt, and the questions, it festered in her son's heart, questions that had remained unanswered for years. When Sarah had heard about the charity event that the CEO was hosting, she saw an opportunity, not just for herself, but for Max. She knew he had to face the man who had once promised the world to her and then walked away. Sarah had made her peace with the past, but she knew her son deserved the truth. It wasn't just about money or apologies. It was about understanding who he was, where he came from, and the man who had chosen to leave them behind. Back at the event, the CEO struggled to process what had just happened. The words hung in the air, thick with unspoken truths. Max was waiting for a response, his eyes wide with curiosity and a quiet sort of hope. Sarah stood at the edge of the room, watching with bated breath, unsure of what would come next. This was her son's moment, and all she could do was hope that the man before them would finally own up to his past. The room had fallen silent, but there was an undercurrent of tension, like the stillness before a storm. People whispered among themselves, some unsure of whether to intervene, while others wondered how this would play out. But there was no turning back now. The billionaire CEO, his posture, stiff and guarded, slowly rose to his full height. The expression on his face was unreadable, stoic, almost emotionless. He locked eyes with Max, his gaze softening just a fraction. Max's heart raced, his little hands trembling slightly, but he didn't look away. He had waited years for this moment. The man before him wasn't a superhero or a figure of authority. He was just a man who had hurt his mother, abandoned them, and left a hole in their lives. What did he want now? What could he possibly say to make it right? The CEO's voice broke the silence, low and steady. "Max," he began, but then hesitated, as if searching for the right words. I didn't know you'd be here, and I didn't expect this." Max's brow furrowed. "You abandoned us," he repeated, his voice barely above a whisper, but it carried an undeniable weight. "Mom said you just left, and you didn't even care." There was no answer at first. The CEO's eyes drifted down to the floor, his fingers twitching as though he were trying to hold himself together. This wasn't part of the plan. There was no boardroom protocol for this. no investment strategy, just a past that he had tried to bury beneath wealth and success. Could he explain himself? Could he fix it? Could he undo the damage? For a long moment, the billionaire said nothing, his thoughts racing. He had built this empire, but was it worth it? He had always told himself that his decisions had been for the best, that sacrifices were part of the game. But now, standing in front of this child, those justifications felt like lies. Was the legacy worth it if he had lost the most important thing in his life? The life he had once shared with Sarah, the woman who had believed in him when no one else did. "I'm sorry," the CEO finally said, his voice almost a whisper. "I was wrong." Max's face remained stoic, but there was a flicker of something in his eyes. Maybe disbelief, maybe something else. The room seemed to hold its breath, waiting for more. Was this the apology Sarah had waited for? Was this the moment that could bring closure to years of hurt and resentment? But before the moment could fully unfold, the unexpected happened. A loud voice from the back of the room interrupted the fragile silence. "He's lying." The crowd turned, and there, standing in the doorway, was a figure Sarah knew all too well, the CEO's ex-wife, the woman who had never quite accepted Sarah's presence in their past. She was here, and she had something to say. What followed next would shock everyone, but that, my friends, is a story for another time. The room froze as the ex-wife of the CEO stepped into the spotlight. Her presence was commanding, her voice sharp with years of resentment. She stood tall, her arms crossed, looking directly at the CEO. "He's lying," she repeated, her voice steady but full of fury. "You think you can just apologize, and everything will be fine. You think saying sorry will make it all go away." Max turned his head, the confusion in his eyes deepening. Sarah's hand tightened around the edge of the table, her heart racing. She knew this woman, knew the history she shared with the CEO, and knew that whatever came next, it wasn't going to be easy. The billionaire's face turned pale as his. Ex-wife walked up to the front, her eyes burning with anger. She wasn't there to settle old scores. She was there to expose the truth. "You abandoned us too," she said, her voice cold. "But at least you could have had the decency to tell your son the real reason, the truth that none of us wanted to admit." Max's confusion grew, but his determination didn't waver. He turned back to the CEO, his voice a little louder now, stronger. "What truth? What did you do?" His words cut through the air like a blade. The billionaire stumbled, unsure of how to respond. His past, a tangled mess of decisions he'd long buried, was suddenly exposed for all to see. The woman before him, the mother of his child, had every right to be angry, but it wasn't just her. Max, his own flesh and blood, was now looking to him for answers. This wasn't a boardroom negotiation. This was real life. The CEO started, but the ex-wife beat him to it, her anger boiling over. He didn't leave because of ambition. He didn't leave because of work. Her eyes were burning with resentment. He left because he couldn't handle the truth. The truth about the people he'd hurt, the people he'd betrayed. He couldn't face it, and so he ran. He ran from Sarah. He ran from Max. And he ran from the man he used to be. The room fell into a stunned silence. Max stood frozen, his mouth slightly open as he processed the words. The CEO, his face now pale, looked down at the floor as though the weight of the world had suddenly crushed him. His ex-wife's words hung in the air, lingering, haunting. Sarah, her heart pounding, stepped forward, her voice soft but firm. "You were never the man I thought you were," she said, her eyes locked onto the CEO. "You were a dream I believed in, but you stopped believing in us a long time ago. And now, years later, you think an apology is enough, that it'll erase the pain, the loneliness, the scars. Max looked up at his mother, his eyes wide and full of confusion. He didn't fully understand it all, but one thing was clear. His mother, Sarah, had given him the greatest gift of all, the truth. She had shown him that it wasn't the apology that mattered. It was the understanding who they were, where they came from, and what truly mattered. The billionaire CEO, standing there, broken and defeated, had no answers to give. His empire, his success, it all seemed meaningless in the face of the truth. The love he had walked away from, the son he had abandoned, and the woman who had once stood by his side. It all came rushing back to him, a flood of emotions he could no longer hide. "Max," the CEO whispered, his voice barely audible. "I'm sorry. I wasn't strong enough to be the man you needed." Max took a long, steady breath, his little chest rising and falling with the weight of it all. He was no longer the boy seeking answers. He was becoming his own person, understanding that some things couldn't be fixed with an apology. "I don't need you to be sorry," Max said softly, his voice steady beyond his years. "I need you to understand that you left us, and we had to learn to live without you." Sarah smiled gently at her son, a quiet sense of peace settling in her heart. She had spent years trying to move on, trying to find healing, but in this moment, she knew Max had found something far more important. He had found his strength. He had found his voice. The CEO stood there, a man broken by his past, a man who had everything and nothing at the same time. He had the world's riches, but it didn't matter. Not now. The life he had left behind could never be bought back, no matter how hard he tried. As the scene in the room began to quiet down, the CEO finally spoke one last time. "I'll never be able to undo what I've done, but I will spend the rest of my life trying to make things right. Not for the world to see, but for you, Max, and for you, Sarah." Sarah nodded, her expression softening. She had long ago come to terms with the fact that she would never get the answers she wanted from him. But this was enough. It was the closure they both needed. Max had his answer, and Sarah, in her own way, had hers. As the event came to a close, the tension that had filled the room slowly dissipated. People began to talk again, but the weight of what had just happened hung in the air like a thick fog. The CEO's apology wouldn't fix everything, but it was a start. It was a start toward understanding, toward healing, and toward the truth that had been buried for so long. For Max and Sarah, the road ahead was uncertain, but one thing was clear. They would walk it together, stronger than before. And as they left the event, hand in hand, they knew they had something more important than wealth or power. They had each other, and they had the truth. And that was enough. The story wasn't over. It had only just begun.